Good morning. It is Sunday, March the 6th. Thank God it's Sunday, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Pledge of Allegiance, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, we will have regulators, no free lunch, and conservatives and liberals. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March 6th. You will defeat the enemies of your finances. I have promised that I will defend my people and keep them from harm. I will strike your enemies with great panic, and they will seize each other by the hand and attack one another. The wealth of all your surrounding enemies will be collected, great quantities of silver and gold and material possessions, and will be given to my people. Blessed is the man who fears me and finds great delight in my commands. Your children will be mighty in the land, and your generations will be blessed. Honor me with the wealth that I have given you, and your barns will be filled to overflowing. My blessing upon you brings wealth, and I will add no trouble to it. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, Psalm 112, verses 2 and 3, John chapter 10, verse 10. Prayer declaration. In the name of Jesus, I bind and cast out every thief that would try to steal my finances. The Lord will rebuild the finances of his people and give the treasures of the nations to them. I will not put my hope in my wealth, but I will place my hope in God, who richly has provided me with everything for my enjoyment. I will lay up treasure for myself in heaven and take hold of life eternal. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March 6th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative tactics in support of true conservative strategy to defeat the socialists? Number one, and most important, that the true conservative refuse to prove a negative and insist that the socialist instead prove a positive. Thank you, thank you. So what is the true conservative strategy for defeating the socialists politically in this country? It is to attack the socialists from the bottom up, to demoralize and defeat the rank and file socialist that we encounter each and every day. And by so doing, we will discourage them from returning people like Nancy Pelosi to office. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservatives' political priorities? Number one, the abolition of abortion throughout the country. Number two, making nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons obsolete. Number three, the decertification of public employee unions throughout the country. And number four, assigning criminal and civil liability to all regulators across the country. Thank you, thank you. And now there's no free lunch. The whole gospel of Karl Marx can be summed up in a single sentence. Hate the man who is better off than you are. Never under any circumstances admit that his success may be due to his own efforts, to the productive contribution he has made to the whole community. Always attribute his success to the exploitation, the cheating, the more or less open robbery of others. Never under any circumstances admit that your own failure may be owing to your own weakness, or that the failure of anyone else may be due to his own defects, his laziness, incompetence, improvidence, or stupidity. Henry Hazlitt. Marxism is, at its core, a theology of oppression, the belief that history is the story of a victim and a victimizer. It must first start with the demonization of who will fit this role of victimizer, and to do that, the achievements of the successful must be reduced to sinisterism. But just as much as fantasy is needed to create this oppressor, so is fantasy needed to create the permanently oppressed. And that is, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, conservatives and liberals. For some conservatives, government is always too big and public employees are overcompensated loafers. On the other side, liberals lionize public sector unions, but don't always face up to the financial consequences of unions' wage and benefit contracts. Yet such attitudes, which are caricatures of themselves, don't take us very far. I have no stake in trashing Republicans or in helping Democrats or vice versa. My aim is to understand the rise and role of public sector unions in American politics and follow the evidence where it leads. Looking beyond partisan disputes, this book offers a case for skepticism about the benefit of public employee unionization and a way to think about the future of unionism in government. A premise of this book is that the analysis of public sector unions must be shorn of mythology and separated from the legendary struggles of private sector labor in the mid-20th century. Rather, public employee unions must be analyzed with the same detachment as when studying other interest groups in American political life, each of which has its own set of incentives, goals, and constraints. Many studies of organized labor, especially those examining the private sector, have a tendency to romanticize union struggles, pitting David, the workers, against Goliath, large companies. However, teachers, cops, and correction officers lack the victimhood status of industrial workers battling capitalist barons. This may partly explain why scholars have devoted so little attention to the study of public sector unions. Today, there is more vigorous discussion in the public square than there is in academe about the advantages and disadvantages of unionized government. This discussion was sparked by the 2008-2011 recession, the fiscal problems of American governments, and Republicans' efforts to exploit the issue for political gain. Therefore, I believe that an unvarnished account will interest people across the political spectrum, liberals as well as conservatives, public employees as well as those in private sector. Indeed, public employee unions' effects on state and local government present an ensemble of issues that impact all of us. To craft such an account, I translate academic scholarship into prose accessible to the layperson, compile media stories and think tank studies, rely on government documents, and bring to bear my own research on the subject. Yet, getting beyond partisan sniping requires first engaging the arguments of both sides. Since the 1930s, Republicans and conservatives have not been keen on either unions, public or private, or expansive government. Therefore, unions composed of government workers that seek to increase taxes and expand government are particularly anathema to them. Attacking unions strokes many conservatives' erogenous zones. Conservatives are likely to find my skeptical and at times critical treatment of public sector unions congenial. Yet, my hope is that it will refine and enlarge their views on what is a complex subject without simple solutions. The last generation of conservatives defined themselves against government. Their central goal was to reduce government size. Yet, simply swinging the Budget Act and punishing public servants are misguided responses to current problems. While cuts must sometimes be made, we need a sensible approach that doesn't gut services that many citizens depend on. Nor will bashing public workers improve the economy, revive cities, or solve the slow-moving pension crisis. Such blunt approaches will limit conservatives' ability to participate in the important conversation about how to improve government productivity in the future, which is arguably the number one domestic issue. In simply focusing on the size of government, some conservatives missed a chance to examine and engage the real problems citizens confront, which require government action. Back in a minute. Thank you. Too often, conservatives are unwilling or unable to admit that some government programs are necessary and sometimes do a great deal of good. Furthermore, some conservatives are too quick to believe that public sector unions are at the root of both dysfunctional bureaucracy and the growth of government. The truth is that these are complex issues and there is no single explanation or easy solution. While public employee unions do impact these outcomes, their role is more nuanced and limited, as I explain in later chapters. Being satisfied with simple explanations will only serve to exclude conservatives from the crucial debate about how to make government more productive in the face of tight budgets. Instead, conservatives need to engage in the nettlesome details of public policy. To that end, conservatives should also be attentive to the many possible unintended consequences of making big changes in public sector labor relations. For instance, moving too quickly to reduce public employee compensation could reduce the quality of the government workforce on which citizens depend. This can have a negative impact on the production of human capital, especially in the school system, which would ultimately rebound to weakening the private sector. Business needs well-educated workers. Public schools will provide most of them. Conservatives also want government to regulate business efficiently and effectively. Yet, if government cannot hire and retain good people, the wait times for licensing, permitting, and regulatory approval will grow longer. Starting and running a business or charitable enterprise will become more difficult. Conservatives also value public order, that if police training programs are cut, corruption and incompetence can ensue, undermining law and order. And these examples are just for starters. On the other side, the ideas, values, and instincts of most Democrats and liberals have long tied them to unionism. They struggle to see a difference between public and private sector unions. They scorn the notion that America would be better off if public employee unions were less powerful or didn't exist at all. To the contrary, as Washington Post columnist Harold Meyerson put it, such unions are the linchpin of progressive change in America. In this view, public employee unions provide political balance in society and are the bulwark against broader injustices in the world. The unions help preserve a slice of the middle class that would otherwise be plunged through conservatives' efforts to privatize government work into the vicious race to the bottom. Furthermore, the safe, orderly, predictable, and egalitarian workplace they've created is the model for the private sector. Most Democratic politicians still see giving up on government unionism as political suicide. The unions are core financial contributors to their party and its candidates. They staff the get-out-the-vote drives that get minority voters to the polls. Without them, many Democrats hold, the GOP and big business would dominate American politics. Few liberal Democrats are willing to concede that collective bargaining in government has any downsides at all. Centrists admit that there are problems, but are likely to want to change the subject. The Democrats face a real contradiction within their coalition insofar as the unions are powerful and they rely on them during election time. Many Democrats will remain reluctant to criticize the unions because they have strong incentives not to. Therefore, making the case that they too should be skeptical of government unionism is a high peak to climb. For instance, defenders of public employee unions, such as former Clinton-era Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, have charged that humble public workers are being targeted as scapegoats for the nation's recent economic misfortune. They argue that the public employees live modest lives and aren't paid much better than workers in the private sector. The act of criticizing public servants thus distracts attention from rising income inequality and corporate executives who are the real culprits between today's economic woes. Yet, being highly critical of corporate misbehavior should not stop one from recognizing the downsides of unionized government, and as long as public sector unions persist, they will offer ample opportunities for conservatives to distract attention from liberal projects. Back in a minute. Thank you. In some ways, I hope that more liberals than conservatives read this book. In fact, I'd argue that liberalism's political future depends on considering this issue. As historian Walter Russell Mead has pointed out, public sector union support, however attractive in the short term, is a poisoned chalice in today's world. Insofar as liberals want government to do more to create more equal opportunities, protect citizens from market failures, and lift up the poor, having to defend the costs and inefficiencies opposed by public sector unions is a major drag. The Achilles heel of American liberalism is that it occasionally turns a blind eye to the dysfunctional aspects of public monopolies. On the other hand, the big business Republicans tend to overlook the problems with private sector monopolies. When American government performs poorly, so does American liberalism. And with government likely to face tight budgets at all levels for this foreseeable future, a central debate in American politics will be about how to make government more productive. Democrats cannot carry government unions water and participate effectively in that debate at the same time. In short, how to deal with public sector unions in their midst presents Democrats with a real challenge, as they must rely on the union's power, but need to confront that power to make important policy changes. My hope is that this book will prompt readers to reconsider their views on unionized government. I hope it will lead them to question whether the benefits that accrue to public workers through unionization and collective bargaining outweigh the costs to taxpayers and those who rely on government services. In today's polarized political environment, it is even hard to get people to admit that there are trade-offs among policies they support. To prompt such reconsideration, I show that there are indeed serious trade-offs involved in a commitment to activist government that provides an array of goods and services to its citizens, especially the middle class and the poor, and a commitment to unionism and collective bargaining in the public sector. The problem is that the two commitments often work at cross purposes, making it nearly impossible to consistently champion government workers and advance the public interest. Finally, as government unionism generates stories of influence peddling and excessive salaries for public workers, it becomes a cause for citizen skepticism about government in general, which undermines the trust in government that grand liberal projects of state activism require. Democrats believe that government can do a great deal of good in society. They believe in the values of technocratic expertise in staffing the bureaucracy. However, if government is tied down by previously negotiated work rules, if the unions make it politically difficult to eliminate ineffective programs to make room for new policy experiments, and if the costs of employees' benefits devour the budget, then no matter who is elected, there will be a big gap between what government wants to do and what it can do. Transferring rights and resources to government workers and their unions only makes it more difficult to provide these things to the broader public. As long as the Democratic Party depends extensively on public employee unions, it will be a less effective advocate for the vast majority of working-class Americans who don't have government jobs. The Democrat Party might be better served, and the public better served as well, if it gave up defending the status quo and developed a long-term strategy to raise living standards across the board. It cannot advocate effectively for working-class Americans when the labor movement is dominated by public employees, many of whom are white-collar professionals with college degrees. Without having to defend lifetime employment and generous pensions for public workers, Democrats could talk more persuasively about the things government can and should do, especially for the downtrodden. Excessive entanglement with government unions transforms the Democrat Party into a conservative party resistant to changes in the way government operates. Reinventing government, once a prominent Democratic slogan, is drained of all serious content. Back in a minute. Thank you. Public attitudes regarding unions in general and public sector unions in particular are in flux. Before 1960, public attitudes toward unions were favorable. Yet in 2009, for the first time in a modern era, less than half of Americans told pollsters that they approved of labor unions. In a 2012 Education Next poll, only 22% of Americans thought their teachers' unions had a positive effect on schools, while 40% thought they had neither a positive nor a negative effect. When asked a binary question, positive or negative impact, 51% of Americans said the unions had a negative impact, and 49% said they had a positive impact. That stands in stark contrast to teachers themselves, 71% of whom said unions had a positive impact. Even in labor-friendly California, citizens have soured on public sector unions, as 44% said that they cause more harm and 30% more good, which was part of a net 16-point swing in attitudes about labor unions from positive to negative over the past 2 years. However, according to a U.S. Today Gallup poll, 61% of Americans opposed ending collective bargaining for public employees in 2011. A New York Times CBS News poll that same year produced nearly identical public support of collective bargaining, with only a slight majority of Republicans favoring limiting the practice. Yet a Claris Group poll found that 64% of Americans thought that unions should not represent public employees, and 42% of Democrats felt the same way. The extent, then, to which citizens understand all that is involved in collective bargaining, rather than it just being a nice-sounding phrase suggesting that we should all work together, remains untapped by pollsters. In addition, the states where citizens complain the loudest that their taxes are too high correlate almost perfectly with states where public employee unions are strongest. All told, Americans appear poised to decide whether they believe public sector unions have positive impacts on policies they care about. And that was the section of Chapter 1 called Conservatives and Liberals from the book Government Against Itself by Daniel DeSalvo. Thank you. So I want to make a few comments about about Mr. DeSalvo's this section about conservatives and liberals. First of all, Mr. DeSalvo is setting this up to do the whole book wrong. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read the book anyways because I think it's still going to point up. It's going to be of value in certain ways. One of them is just pointing out how it is that conservatives and generally everybody ends up going wrong. So he's setting himself up to go wrong because he's setting himself up as being an arbitrator. He is setting himself up to join the cult of neutrality. You can't be neutral, okay, on anything in life. There's no neutrality to be had. There's no middle ground. It just doesn't exist. Things are good or bad, or they're right or wrong, or they're evil or good, or whatever the situation is. And the same thing he refuses to do here is to take a good look, hard look at the unions, public employee unions, and decide, are they good or are they evil, and why? And then make the case one way or another. Okay, he's decided that he's going to be a neutral arbitrator and that he's going to present neutral information, and then something is supposed to happen. But what? He doesn't say. So what he's setting himself up for is failure. He's written this book, 292 pages worth, for nothing. It's a book that people are going to read. It's going to be one of these gee whiz books. You read the book and you go, wow, gee whiz, I didn't know that. And then you go about your life and you're going to ignore it. You're not going to pay any attention to it. And neither is anybody in power. The unions aren't going to take it seriously. The politicians aren't going to take it seriously. And nothing is going to change. The other thing that he does is he presents unions as being something that just spontaneously appeared, like a spontaneous generation. Which was a biological fiction that was propounded many decades or centuries ago, that some species occurred because they just spontaneously appeared. And as John F. Kennedy has said, things don't just happen, they're made to happen. And the same thing with public employee unions. Who brought about public employee unions and why? But if he's going to approach this from the standpoint where we just presume the public employee unions without understanding who brought them about and why they were brought about, then again, he's setting himself up for failure. He's going to be a neutral third party, and he's going to have a that's the way it is attitude, where he's going to basically force unions, whether he likes it or not, on the public. Because again, if he doesn't come out against the unions, then he is coming out for the unions. Because again, there's no middle ground. It just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. You're either for or you're against. And so what he is going to end up doing is being for the unions, but pretending that he's neutral. And that makes for an easier sell. Because at the bottom end of it, public employee unions are corrupt. And that's a very, very difficult, if not impossible, sell to the American people. And much to the credit of the American people, they're turning against public employee unions, but unfortunately not for the right reasons. So that's again, but as a conservative, as a true conservative, you need to understand this. Otherwise, you're going to go astray and you're going to lose the arguments. Okay, so you have to know that the issue is, are public employee unions good or bad? There's no neutral. So if somebody tries to come at you neutral, you need to say, well, you're for the unions then. Okay, you need to get them on the record for or against. And if they won't do that, then you have to say, at this particular time, they refuse, well, I'm just not going to do it, they say. Then you have to tell them, I'm sorry, then maybe we can talk some other time. Because there's no discussion to be had. If they're going to lie, even though they think they're not lying, even though they think they're being neutral, if they're going to lie, there's no way to talk to them. There's no way to get through to these people. The bottom line on public employee unions is that when you understand that the essence of corruption is conflict of interest, then when you see that public employee unions are completely compromised that way, have nothing but conflicts of interest, then you know that they're corrupt. And corruption, when you know that corruption is bad. It's not neutral. It's not good. It's bad. And things that are bad have got to go. So public employee unions need to be decertified, and the employees themselves need to be reclassified as, what did they used to call what were they before they were unionized? They were, well, anyways, they had general classifications, civil servants. That was it. So they have to be reclassified as civil servants, paid and treated like civil servants, because that, in reality, is what they are, civil servants. So that's that. Thank you, thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you, thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.